Imagine this, it's 1683 and the mighty Ottoman army, over 100,000 strong, is camped outside the walls of Vienna. For centuries, they were the undisputed superpower of the Mediterranean, a military juggernaut that seemed unstoppable. The fall of Vienna felt not just possible, but inevitable. The city was on the brink of collapse, its defenders exhausted. It looked like the heart of Europe was about to be conquered. But then, the unexpected happened. On September 12th, a massive relief force, led by the Polish King Jan III Sobieski, charged down from the Kahlenberg Hills. The legendary winged hussars crashed into the Ottoman lines, shattering their formation and their morale. The siege was broken. The invincible army was forced into a chaotic retreat, leaving behind a treasure trove of supplies, weapons, and even coffee beans, which famously helped start Vienna's coffeehouse culture. This stunning defeat at Vienna was more than just a single lost battle. It was a massive wake-up call for the Ottoman Empire. For the first time, it became painfully clear that their military technology and tactics were falling behind their European rivals. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a long, grueling struggle spanning over a century and a half. The Ottomans embarked on a massive and often painful project of modernization. They tried to reform their army, their bureaucracy, and their entire state. This period, known as the Tulip Era and later the Tanzimat reforms, saw them adopting European military drills, founding new schools, and attempting to restructure their government. It was a desperate race against time to catch up and survive in a rapidly changing world. The shockwave from that one battle outside Vienna reshaped an empire and set the stage for the modern Middle East. Thanks for watching. If you found this slice of history fascinating, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world. Ever wondered how one of the most powerful empires in history was defeated at the height of its power? Let's travel back to 1683 to the gates of Vienna. The mighty Ottoman Empire, with a colossal army of over 150,000 soldiers, laid siege to the city. Vienna's fall seemed inevitable, a conquest that would have reshaped the map of Europe forever. The city's defenders were outnumbered, exhausted, and on the brink of surrender. All hope seemed lost. But the Ottomans' greatest weakness wasn't on the battlefield. It was right at the top. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, was supremely confident, maybe a little too confident. He was so sure of victory that he neglected to properly fortify his own camp. He focused entirely on taking the city, ignoring the threat of a relief army that he knew was coming. He underestimated his European adversaries, believing they were too divided to unite against him. This single, fatal miscalculation would cost him everything. As the siege dragged on, Kara Mustafa's command style created friction. He alienated his key vassal, the Khan of Crimea, by treating him with disrespect. So, when the Allied European Relief Force, led by the Polish King Jan III Sobieski, was advancing, the Crimean Khan and his formidable cavalry, who were supposed to intercept them, barely put up a fight. They essentially let the enemy walk right up to the main Ottoman camp. On September 12th, the moment of truth arrived. Sobieski launched one of the largest cavalry charges in history from the Kahlenberg Heights overlooking the battlefield. The Ottoman forces, caught completely off guard and with their leadership in disarray, panicked. Kara Mustafa, unable to rally his demoralized troops, was forced into a chaotic retreat. The supposedly invincible army crumbled, not just from the force of the charge, but from a failure of command. The Battle of Vienna wasn't just a military victory. It was a lesson in how arrogance and poor leadership can bring down even the mightiest of empires. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history fascinating, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories like this. See you in the next video. Have you ever wondered how one of the world's most feared armies, the Ottoman military, went from a powerhouse to a shadow of its former self? The answer lies deep within its most famous unit, the Janissaries. To understand their decline, we have to look at what made them so powerful in the first place. The classical Ottoman military system was a masterpiece of the 14th and 15th centuries. It was a perfectly integrated machine. You had the Janissaries, an elite infantry corps recruited through the Devverm system. Young boys were taken from their families, raised in a closed environment, and trained to be loyal only to the Sultan. Then you had the Sipahi cavalry, funded by land grants and a cutting-edge artillery corps, the best in the world during the early 16th century. When Suleiman the Magnificent marched into Europe, this system was at its absolute peak. The weapons were advanced, the tactics were brilliant, and the logistics were unmatched. But here's the critical flaw. This system wasn't designed to evolve. It was designed to be inherited, unchanged. The Devviram system that created the Janissaries wasn't just about recruitment. It was an entire ideology. It gave the soldiers a powerful myth of absolute loyalty and special status, making them incredibly disciplined for over 200 years. But myths can turn into shackles. By the 17th century, the system was crumbling. Janissaries who were forbidden from marrying started bending the rules. They began enrolling their own sons and brothers. Suddenly, the corps was filled with men who hadn't gone through the rigorous isolating training that made the original Janissaries so unique. It started to look less like an elite military force and more like a powerful, hereditary guild with weapons. Their numbers exploded, but their quality plummeted. In the 1500s, there were maybe 15,000 Janissaries. A century later, there were over 50,000 on the payroll, but many were just collecting a paycheck without ever seeing a battlefield. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were stakeholders in a corrupt institution. And this reveals the core problem of Ottoman military decline. It was never just a military issue. The Janissaries had become so entangled in the politics and economy of Istanbul that reforming them was nearly impossible without tearing the empire apart from the inside. It was a political crisis disguised as a military one, a problem that would haunt the Ottoman sultans for centuries to come. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more dives into history. The Janissaries were not simply soldiers. They were a constituency. They garrisoned Istanbul. They were present at every moment of political transition. Sultans who offended them were deposed or worse. Grand viziers who threatened their privileges disappeared. The institution had accumulated not just military power, but veto power over the political system that might otherwise have reformed it. So, when the Ottoman army stood before Vienna in 1683, it did so with the weapons, the doctrine, and the command architecture of a previous era, not because Ottoman commanders were ignorant of European military development, but because the institution capable of carrying out reform had made itself immune to it. Kara Mustafa Pasha was not a fool. He was, by the standards of his time, a capable strategic planner. His decision to invest Vienna rather than accept a Danube crossing battle showed an understanding of siege doctrine, but he operated within a system whose internal logic discouraged risk-adapted flexibility. When the relief force arrived faster than anticipated, when the terrain channeled the Polish cavalry into a gap his forces could not seal, the system could not recalculate in real time. The relief force broke through in hours. The retreat began before nightfall. Kara Mustafa Pasha would not survive the year. Strangled by imperial order in December 1683, he became the convenient explanation for a defeat whose real causes were institutional and therefore unspeakable. It is far easier to execute a grand vizier than to dismantle the system that produced the conditions for his failure. But the wars that followed Vienna would make that reckoning unavoidable. The Habsburgs did not stop at pushing the Ottomans back from the walls of Vienna. They kept advancing. The Venetians reopened southern fronts. The Poles pressed from the north. Russia, under a dynasty that had its own reforming ambitions, began moving toward the Black Sea. In 1699, at Karlowitz, the Ottoman Empire signed a peace treaty that handed Hungary, Transylvania, Podolia, and most of Dalmatia to its enemies. It was the largest territorial contraction the empire had experienced in its history. The map did not lie. The machine had broken down. And now, for the first time in its existence, the Ottoman state was forced to confront a question it had never had to ask seriously before. What do we change? And how do we survive the changing? The answer would take 150 years to arrive. It would pass through 3 sultans, multiple grand viziers, a series of European military advisors, and at least 2 catastrophic political collapses. It would cost lives not on battlefields but in palace corridors on execution grounds, and in the fire set by men who preferred the empire's defeat to the loss of their own privileges. The reckoning had begun. The Treaty of Karlowitz was signed in January 1699. For 17 days, Ottoman and European diplomats sat across tables in a small Serbian town and divided the geography of southeastern Europe. The Ottomans had negotiated peace before. They had conceded territory before in minor adjustments along frontier zones. But Karlowitz was different in character. It was not a settlement between equal parties pausing hostilities. It was a dictated peace from a position of demonstrated military inferiority. The Ottoman delegation understood this. Their written reports back to Istanbul described not just the territorial losses but the quality of the European military forces they had witnessed, the disciplined formations, the coordinated artillery, the command responsiveness that the relief force at Vienna had displayed, and which had now been confirmed across 15 years of continuous campaigning. The reports were accurate. They were also nearly useless without an institutional mechanism to act on them. This is the paradox that defined the first phase of Ottoman military reform. The information existed. The analysis was available. Individuals at the highest levels of the Ottoman state understood with precision what had changed in European warfare and why it mattered. What did not exist, yet, was a political framework capable of translating that understanding into institutional transformation. Consider what European warfare had become by 1700, the military revolution, a process that had reshaped Western European armies across the 16th and 17th centuries, had produced a fundamentally different relationship between the state, taxation, and military power. Standing armies paid by centralized bureaucracies rather than feudal or devvirm-based systems became the norm. Drill, standardized, repetitive, degrading to individual pride but lethal in aggregate, replaced the cultivation of individual martial virtue. The linear formations that replaced older cavalry-dominated tactics required soldiers who would stand in precise, geometric arrangements under fire, fire on command, reload on command, and advance or halt on command. Individual heroism became a liability. Collective mechanism became the objective. This was alien to Ottoman military culture in its deepest assumptions. The Sipahi cavalry prized individual skill, horsemanship, lance work, swordsmanship developed over a lifetime. The Janissary tradition, even as it degraded organizationally, retained an ideological framework built around the warrior identity of individual soldiers. The idea of drilling men into interchangeable components of a firing mechanism was not merely tactically novel. It was socially offensive. But the wars continued, and the losses continued, and the evidence accumulated. In 1716 and 1717, a series of campaigns against Austria under the command of Prince Eugene of Savoy demonstrated with brutal consistency what trained linear, infantry and competently coordinated artillery could do against Ottoman formations that still maneuvered according to older tactical logic. The Battle of Petrovaradin in August 1716 destroyed an Ottoman army that substantially outnumbered the Habsburg force facing it. The battle was not decided by courage or numbers. It was decided by volley fire discipline, artillery positioning, and the ability of Habsburg commanders to exploit Ottoman command delays in real time. The Treaty of Passarowitz in 1718 stripped yet more territory. Belgrade, taken with great effort in previous campaigns, was surrendered. This was the context in which Grand Vizier Nevivaherli Damed Ibrahim Pasha and Sultan Ahmed III inaugurated what later Ottoman historians would call the Tulip Era, a period of cultural opening, diplomatic engagement with European capitals, and the first systematic attempts to understand, document, and partially adopt European military techniques. The approach was deliberate but limited. Ottoman ambassadors were dispatched to Paris and Vienna with explicit instructions that went beyond the usual diplomatic courtesies. They were to observe, to attend military reviews, to visit arsenals and fortification works, to bring back not just reports but drawings, manuals, and if possible, technical personnel. Yermoseka's Mehmed Kalibi, dispatched to Paris in 1720, produced a remarkably detailed account of French military organization, court culture, and technical institutions. His observations on Vauban's fortification system, the mathematical geometry of interlocking defensive fire that had transformed European siege warfare, were specific and informed. He understood what he was looking at. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a pivotal moment in history, the dramatic military reforms of the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the Janissaries were the elite fighting force, the tip of the Ottoman spear. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, they had become a shadow of their former selves, more interested in politics and business than in battle. They resisted any change, which left the empire vulnerable to its rapidly modernizing European rivals. Sultan Selim III was one of the first to see the writing on the wall. He tried to create a new, modern army called the Nizam-i, or New Order. He brought in European advisors, introduced new weapons, and implemented Western-style training. But the Janissaries and other powerful groups saw this as a threat. They rose up, deposed Selim, and brutally crushed his new army. It seemed like reform was impossible, but the need for change didn't go away. Enter Sultan Mahmud II. He learned from Selim's mistakes. Instead of building a new army alongside the old one, he knew the Janissaries had to go. In 1826, in an event known as the Auspicious Incident, Mahmud used his new loyal artillery units to bombard the Janissary barracks. He completely dismantled the corps, ending their centuries-long influence once and for all. With the Janissaries gone, Mahmud was free to build a truly modern military. He created the Assassinations Mansurai Muhammadai, or the victorious soldiers of Muhammad. This new army was based on the European model of conscription, with military academies, standardized uniforms, and modern tactics. This wasn't just about changing soldiers. It was about changing the entire state. These reforms laid the groundwork for the wider Tanzimat reforms that would attempt to completely reorganize and save the Ottoman Empire in its final century. It was a bloody and difficult process, but it fundamentally reshaped the course of Ottoman history. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you in the next one. The empire needed more battles, more losses, more territorial hemorrhage before the political calculus would shift enough to allow a second attempt. Russia provided the pressure. Peter the Great's reforms had created a military force capable of fighting the Ottomans, on terms that previous Russian rulers could not have managed. By mid-century, Catherine the Great's armies were moving south with consistent operational success. The 1768 to 1774 war produced the Treaty of Köy-Narka, the most consequential diplomatic defeat of the century. Russia gained Black Sea access, the right to navigate Ottoman waters, and influence over Orthodox Christian populations throughout the empire. The Crimean Khanate, the great northern buffer that had kept Russian power at distance from the Black Sea coast, was detached from Ottoman suzerainty and would be formally annexed by Russia in 1783. The geography of Ottoman vulnerability was now fully exposed. And in the palace in Istanbul, a young prince was watching and calculating and drawing conclusions that his predecessors had reached, but never had the institutional space or the will to act on completely. His name was Selim. He would become sultan in 1789, and he would attempt to do what no Ottoman ruler had yet managed: build a new army while the old army still stood. On April 7, 1789, Selim III ascended to the throne of an empire under simultaneous military pressure on three fronts. Austria and Russia had coordinated operations that were pushing into Ottoman Balkan and Caucasian territory. The army dispatched to meet them was fighting with the familiar combination of individual unit courage and systemic organizational inadequacy. Commanders were receiving reports hours after the situations they described had changed. Artillery was being positioned by officers whose understanding of enfilade geometry was intuitive rather than mathematical. The cavalry was effective in terrain that suited it and catastrophic in terrain that did not, with no mechanism to adapt between them. Selim had been watching this from close distance for years before he became sultan. He had corresponded, while still a prince, with Louis XVI of France, an almost unimaginable breach of Ottoman court protocol, and a sign of how seriously he was tracking the problem. He had read reports. He had consulted advisors. He had formed, with unusual precision for a man who had spent most of his life in the gilded confinement of the palace harem system, a systematic analysis of what needed to change. His conclusion was architectural, not a reform of the Janissaries, not an improvement of the existing system. A parallel system. A new army, built alongside the old one, trained on European methods, equipped with modern weapons, officered by men who had been educated in the new technical schools rather than promoted through Janissary patronage networks. He called it the Nizam-i, the new order, the political calculation behind this. Approach was as sophisticated as the military one. Selim understood, with the clarity of a man who had seen grand viziers executed and sultans deposed, that a direct assault on the Janissary institution would produce an immediate political catastrophe. The Janissaries could not be reformed from within, their internal power. Structure would resist and then eliminate any reformer who tried. They could not be abolished by decree. Their physical presence in Istanbul made them capable of reversing any decree with force. But perhaps they could be made irrelevant, gradually, by building something next to them that was so obviously superior that the case for transition would become self-evident even to those with interests in the old system. This was the wager. It was not a naive one. Selim knew the risks. His reformist advisors, the men he gathered around him in a consultative process that itself was novel for Ottoman governance, knew the risks. A document known as the Layha Collection, a series of reform memoranda submitted to Selim by advisors from various institutional backgrounds, survives and gives extraordinary insight into the thinking of this circle. The advisors were not uniformly optimistic. Several explicitly warned that the Janissary institution would view any parallel force as an existential threat and would work to destroy it regardless of the official framing. They were correct, but Selim proceeded. The Nizam-i was formally established in 1793. Its organization drew explicitly on European models. French military advisors, their presence made more politically palatable by the anti-Austrian, anti-Russian strategic alignment of France and the Ottoman Empire, assisted in drafting regulations. The training curriculum specified drill techniques derived from French infantry manuals. Officers were to be appointed on merit and technical qualification, not on connection to existing patronage networks. Ever wonder how a military reform could shake an entire empire to its core? Let's travel back to the late 18th century Ottoman Empire, a sprawling power facing a crisis. Sultan Selim III, a visionary ruler, saw the writing on the wall. The empire's traditional army, the Janissaries, were once the most feared soldiers in the world, but now they were falling behind modern European armies. Their discipline was gone and their loyalty was questionable. Selim's bold answer was the Nizam-i, or the New Order. This wasn't just a new uniform, it was a revolutionary idea. He aimed to build a modern, European-style army from the ground up. He brought in French and Swedish officers to train Turkish recruits in the latest tactics and with the newest weapons. He established new schools, barracks, and even factories to support this new force. For a while, it seemed to be working. The Nizam-i troops were disciplined, effective, and loyal directly to the Sultan. They proved their worth in battles, even holding their own against Napoleon's forces in Egypt. But this radical change created powerful enemies. The Janissaries saw the new order as a direct threat to their power, their privileges, and their very existence. They weren't alone. Many religious scholars and conservative elites viewed these Western-style reforms as a betrayal of Islamic tradition. They rallied public opinion against the Sultan, painting him as an infidel abandoning the old ways. The tension finally exploded in 1807, a rebellion, fueled by the Janissaries and their conservative allies, swept through Istanbul. Outnumbered and facing overwhelming opposition, Selim III was forced to disband his beloved Nizam-i. Tragically, he was deposed and later assassinated, and his dream of a modern Ottoman army died with him. The new order was gone, but its spirit wasn't. The need for reform was undeniable, and the seeds planted by Selim's brave but ill-fated experiment would eventually sprout again, paving the way for future changes that would transform the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. The Janissaries had allies outside the corps itself. The ulama, the religious scholarly establishment, had its own suspicions of a reform program built on explicitly European models, trained by non-Muslim advisors, funded through a new and opaque revenue mechanism. The reform, however carefully framed in Islamic-compatible language, smelled of innovation in the most dangerous theological sense of the word. It smelled of deviation. Istanbul's social and commercial networks had their own embedded relationships with the Janissary system. The corps functioned as a police force, a protection racket, an employment system, a social identity for tens of thousands of people who had never served in a military campaign. Reforming the army meant disrupting an entire urban ecosystem. Selim moved carefully. Too carefully, some of his advisors believed. He consistently refrained from making the confrontation explicit. He did not publicly challenge the Janissary institution's legitimacy. He did not propose its abolition. He maintained the polite fiction that the Nizam-i was an addition rather than a replacement. The Janissaries were not deceived. They were patient. The crisis, when it came not from Istanbul but from the Balkans, from a military expedition dispatched to reassert control over the Danubian provinces, which had become focal points of local power resistance to the reforming central government. The expedition brought Nizam-i setted units into operational contact with Janissary units for the first time in a sustained way. The friction between the two forces in their training, their discipline, their command responsiveness, was visible and commented on by officers on all sides. The Janissary officers reported back to Istanbul with a specific narrative. The new order was not better. It was foreign. It was un-Islamic. It was a sultan's vanity project that humiliated the traditional defenders of the faith. Whether the men in Istanbul who received these reports believed them is uncertain. What is certain is that they acted as if they did. The rebellion that destroyed the Nizam-i did not begin as a coup. It began as a military grievance in May 1807 in the Balkans. A unit of Janissaries stationed along the Danube frontier refused orders to wear European-style uniforms, a component of the Nizam-i training integration program that had been cautiously extended to select traditional units as a test of broader adoption. The refusal spread quickly. Within days, what had begun as a localized uniform dispute had become a political movement with a specific target. The leader who emerged was a Janissary officer named Kabak Mustafa. He was neither a strategic thinker nor an administrator. He was a man who understood, with the precise instincts of a political animal, that he was speaking for a constituency that had been waiting for an opportunity. The movement marched toward Istanbul. What matters from the perspective of military institutional history is what happened next, or rather, what did not happen. The Nizam-i said it existed. It had thousands of men. It had, in aggregate, better training and better drill than the Janissary units now moving against the capital. The tactical calculation on paper should have been favorable. It was not tested. A combination of factors, the unwillingness of some Nizam-i commanders to commit to a battle that could escalate into urban civil, war the absence of clear orders from a sultan who was paralyzed by the speed of events and the defection of elements within the palace political network who had quietly aligned with the rebellion, meant that when the moment of confrontation arrived, it did not become a battle. Selim negotiated. He agreed to the abolition of the Nizam-i. He signed the orders. The new army, years of work, lives of reform, the institutional embodiment of what every analytical mind in the empire had concluded was necessary, was dissolved in a matter of days. And Selim himself was deposed, replaced by his cousin Mustafa IV. 3 months later, a counter-movement by officers loyal to reform briefly threatened to restore Selim to power. Mustafa IV, understanding what Selim's restoration would mean for his own position, issued an order that became one of the most consequential single decisions in Ottoman history. He ordered Selim's execution. The executioners entered the chamber. Selim, reportedly calm, was strangled. He was 54 years old. When the officers who had fought for his restoration broke through the palace doors moments later, too late, they found his body. The reforming sultan was dead. The reform army was dissolved. The old institution stood intact. What had the Nizam-i achieved? The answer is complicated. Militarily, it had demonstrated proof of concept. European-style training, applied to Ottoman recruits, produced measurably more disciplined formations. The methodology worked. The officers trained in the new technical schools showed genuine capability. The experiment had been too brief, too politically constrained, and ultimately too small in scale to transform the empire's military posture. But the information it generated, about what worked, about how long training required, about how to structure officer selection, did not disappear when the institution was dissolved. It was carried in the minds of men who survived. Politically, Selim's failure taught a lesson that would define the next phase of reform with brutal clarity. The lesson was this: a reform program that allowed the threatened institution to survive long enough to organize politically would always eventually be destroyed by the institution it threatened. The gradual, parallel approach, the approach that tried to avoid direct confrontation by building alongside rather than replacing, had failed precisely because it gave the Janissaries time to build the coalition that destroyed it. Careful revolution, in a system where the revolutionaries' enemies had veto power through force, was not a viable strategy. The next reformer would have to move differently. He would have to be willing to provoke the confrontation deliberately, on ground of his own choosing, before the opposition could organize. He would have to be willing to accept that the moment of maximum political danger was unavoidable, and therefore that the correct response to it was not to defer it, but to control when and how it arrived. This reformer existed. He was already sultan. His name was Mahmud II. He had come to power in 1808, having survived the chaos that followed Selim's death. He had watched his predecessor's execution. He had watched the Nizam-i Setted dissolved. He had spent years as a sultan with limited real power, maneuvering carefully within constraints that would have broken a less patient man. He was patient, he was also building. The decade and a half between 1810 and 1826 were not passive years in Ottoman military history, though they might appear so compared to the dramatic events before and after them. Mahmud was not rebuilding the Nizam-i Setted in its old form. That would have been the same provocation that had destroyed Selim without Selim's years of preparation. Instead, he was doing something more subtle and ultimately more lethal to the Janissary institution. He was introducing technical improvements within the existing Janissary framework, improvements that required the corps to accept external expertise, to acknowledge that performance could be measured, and to concede incrementally that the old ways were inadequate. He was creating technical schools whose graduates would eventually form the officer cadre of whatever came after. He was building relationships with European military advisors, Prussian, French, who could provide the curriculum and the methodology when the moment came. He was also watching for the right crisis. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821, provided it. The Janissary performance in Greece was catastrophic. Against irregular fighters using terrain and hit-and-run tactics, Janissary formations demonstrated every pathology that the reform critics had documented for decades. Insubordination, refusal of orders, looting of civilian populations that turned potential supporters into enemies, inability to sustain coherent operations in unfavorable terrain. The military record was unambiguous. Mahmud observed it carefully. He was preparing not just an argument for reform, he was preparing a prosecution. The name Mahmud's court would give it was the Vaka-i, the auspicious incident. It is one of the more ironic labels in military history. What happened in Istanbul in June 1826 was not an incident. It was a prepared operation. It was not auspicious in the sense of being fortunate by chance. It was auspicious in the sense that Mahmud had engineered it to be so, had created the conditions under which the Janissary corps would do exactly what it always did, and then ensured that this time the military force waiting to respond was loyal to him and capable of lethal effect. The opening move was public and deliberate. In late May 1826, Mahmud announced the formation of a new infantry training unit, the Akensi Corps. Within the existing Janissary structure, the unit would be trained on European drill methods. Attendance would be mandatory for designated Janissary regiments. The announcement was phrased carefully. It did not threaten the Janissary institution as a whole. It did not mention abolition. It proposed what sounded like a professional development program. The Janissaries recognized what it actually was. On the night of June 14th to 10th, 1826, Janissary units in Istanbul overturned their great soup cauldrons, the traditional signal of rebellion, a gesture with centuries of institutional meaning, and gathered at the Hippodrome. The rebellion followed the pattern of every previous successful Janissary uprising. Mass in the central open space, demand the removal of the offending advisors and officials. March to the palace if necessary. Wait for the Sultan to capitulate. This was the script. It had worked every time before. Mahmud did not follow his lines. He had in the preceding months positioned artillery units manned by the reformed bombardier corps, the technical corps that traced its lineage back to Bonneval's reforms and had been carefully maintained and improved through the intervening decades around the approaches to the Hippodrome. These were not Janissary units. They were drawn from the navy and the artillery establishment, which had different institutional loyalties and had benefited from the ongoing technical modernization that Mahmud had sustained beneath the political surface. He had secured a fatwa from the Kayhal Islam, the chief Islamic legal authority, declaring the rebellion against a reforming sultan to be contrary to religious law. This was not a small diplomatic move. It split the religious political coalition that had always backed Janissary uprisings by providing moral authority for violent suppression. He had the standard of the Prophet, the Sankak-i Zarif, raised from the palace, calling all Muslims faithful to the Sultan to assemble in his defense. And then he gave the order to fire. The artillery opened on the Hippodrome. The Janissary barracks that had served as the corps' institutional headquarters for centuries were bombarded and then burned. Men who fled the fires were met by cavalry. Men who sought refuge in the city's neighborhoods found a population that had, under decades of Janissary extortion and violence, relatively little institutional sympathy for the corps. The urban networks that had protected Janissary political operations in previous crises did not mobilize to protect them this time. The operation lasted approximately 1 day. The casualties were significant but not systematically recorded. Contemporary estimates range widely. Several thousand Janissaries died in the barracks fires and the subsequent street fighting. Thousands more were arrested. The leadership was executed. The remainder, men who had been Janissaries in name more than in military function, the guild members, and market operators and neighborhood authorities whose connection to the corps was social rather than martial, were given the option of integration into new structures or dispersal. The corps was formally abolished by imperial decree on June 17, 1826. 2 days later, it had ceased to exist as a legal entity. Within weeks, Mahmud announced the formation of the Mansur-i Mohammadi, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad, a new army, built immediately on the ruins of the old one, but drawing on everything that had been learned, preserved, and developed across the preceding century of reform attempts. European advisors arrived, Prussian officers whose systematic military professionalism Mahmud valued specifically. The drill manuals that Selim's schools had developed were retrieved, revised, and implemented. The technical education program that Bonneval had initiated and that various reformers had maintained in attenuated form was expanded into a coherent officer preparation system. The Nizam-i Seded had been an experiment. The Mansur was an institution. The difference was structural. The Mansur was not being built alongside a competing force that could veto its existence. The force that could have done that was ash and scattered bones. But Mahmud had always understood, that destroying the Janissaries was not the completion of military reform. It was the precondition. Picture this. It's the 1820s, and the once mighty Ottoman Empire is feeling the heat. Its legendary Janissaries, once the terror of Europe, have become a shadow of their former selves. They're more interested in politics and business than in actually fighting. Meanwhile, European armies are marching in with new tactics, new weapons, and new discipline. Sultan Mahmud II saw the writing on the wall. He knew if the empire didn't adapt, it would collapse. So he took a massive gamble. He secretly began training a new European-style army called the Assassinations Mansur-i Mohammadi, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad. But the Janissaries weren't going down without a fight. When they found out, they revolted. It was a bloody, decisive moment in Istanbul, but this time the Sultan was ready. He crushed the rebellion, disbanded the Janissaries for good, and paved the way for a modern military. It was a painful, violent birth, but a necessary one for the empire's survival. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more history shorts. The Janissary barracks were still smoldering when the first battalions of the new Manchur army began drilling right there in their shadow. This wasn't a coincidence. Sultan Mahmud II was not a man who left powerful symbols to chance. Drilling his new army on the very ground where the old one was destroyed was a huge statement. It declared that the empire's military future would be built directly on the wreckage of its past, not by pretending its failures never happened. The creation of the Manchur army was much faster than previous attempts at reform. Why? Because the political environment was completely different? There was no competing institution left to organize any opposition. The powerful Janissary lobby that once stalked the palace corridors was gone. The religious factions aligned with them could no longer block the Sultan's orders. The path was finally clear. So what filled this new void? Mahmud brought in Prussian officers led by a name you might recognize, Helmuth von Moltke the Elder. Arriving in 1835, Moltke spent 6 years advising the Ottoman army. His impact went way beyond just weapons or drills. He was a deep, systematic military thinker who understood that real strength comes from staff structure, intelligence, and disciplined planning. His observations give us an incredibly precise look into the Ottoman army of the time, and his conclusions were measured, but also quite sobering. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more. The new army drilled well. The formations were more coherent than anything the Janissaries had produced in their late-period decline. The artillery corps, building on generations of interrupted but real development, was approaching European standards in technical execution, if not yet in operational integration. The officer corps of the schools, men trained in mathematics, cartography, French, and military science, was producing graduates who could plan and execute operations with a conceptual sophistication that had been absent from Ottoman command culture for a century. But the institutional depth was shallow. The officer corps was numerically insufficient for the force structure being built. The non-commissioned officer layer, the experienced sergeants and section leaders who transmit training into operational practice and who cannot be manufactured by schools but must be grown through years of institutional experience, did not exist. The Janissaries, whatever their organizational pathologies, had centuries of accumulated institutional memory. The Manchur was 18 months old. Moltke observed that the Manchur's performance in field exercises was credible. He was more guarded about what it would do under the specific cognitive pressure of actual combat, under the information deprivation, the command communication breakdowns, the physical attrition and fear that transformed even well-drilled formations into test cases for institutional resilience. The test came in 1839. The Battle of Nizam, fought in June 1839 against the Egyptian forces of Ibrahim Pasha Muhammad alias son and operational commander, was the first major engagement in which the Manchur faced a comparably modernized force in open field operations. It was a disaster, not because the Manchur fought poorly at the unit level. The battalions maintained their formations under pressure longer than Janissary units would have in equivalent circumstances. The artillery was positioned more competently than the older doctrine would have allowed. But at the command level, at the level of operational decision-making, of reading terrain, of adapting formation plans when the enemy did something unexpected, the Ottoman army senior commanders made errors that accumulated into catastrophe. The army's commanding general, Hafiz Pasha, had received intelligence suggesting Ibrahim Pasha intended to remain on the defensive. He advanced into terrain that left his flanks exposed based on this assessment. The intelligence was wrong. Ibrahim Pasha's forces moved with operational initiative. The exposed flanks were struck before the Ottoman center had secured the ground in front of it. The army broke. In hours, a campaign was lost. This was Clausewitz's friction made visible, the gap between the plan and the reality multiplied by the cognitive limitations of commanders who were trained well in the specific skills of their arm of service but had not yet developed the broader operational judgment that comes only from experience. Moltke, watching the preparations for the campaign with increasing unease, had warned in private correspondence that the army was not ready for a major offensive operation. He was correct. His warning did not alter the plan. The defeat at Nizam was not the end. Mahmud II died 8 days later of tuberculosis, never learning the full extent of the disaster, and his successors continued the reform program. The Tanzimat reforms of the 1840s embedded military modernization within a broader institutional restructuring of the empire. The military schools became more systematic. The officer corps deepened over decades. The non-commissioned officer problem was addressed, imperfectly, over a generation of accumulated field experience. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 placed the reformed Ottoman military alongside British and French forces in operations against Russia. The performance was uneven but not disgraceful. Ottoman units demonstrated tactical competence that European observers found credible, if not uniformly impressive. The logistical and command pathologies that had persisted from the pre-reform era were still visible. But the army that fought in the Crimea was qualitatively different from anything that had existed in 1826. Measurably, demonstrably different. This is the arc that began at Vienna in 1683 and closed, provisionally, incompletely, somewhere in the mid-19th century. 170 years, 6 or 7 distinct reform attempts. 3 sultans directly engaged in the project, 1 sultan executed for it. 1 institution of 600-year antiquity destroyed in a single day of artillery fire. Multiple European advisors, multiple military schools, multiple moments where the effort was reversed, dissolved, or burned to the ground by the forces it threatened. What does this history tell us about the nature of military reform itself? It tells us that military institutions do not fail gradually. They fail suddenly, in moments of operational stress, in ways that reveal the accumulated inadequacy of years of institutional stagnation. The defeat at Vienna in 1683 was sudden. Its causes were decades old. It tells us that information about military inadequacy is rarely the constraint. The Ottomans had detailed, accurate, technically sophisticated analysis of what had changed in European warfare almost from the moment it changed. The constraint was political, the existence of an institution capable of destroying any reform process that threatened it. It tells us that the reform that finally succeeded did so not because it was more technically sophisticated than its predecessors. Selim's Nizam-i said it was arguably as well designed as Mahmud's Mansour. The difference was the political condition under which reform operated. Mahmud had eliminated the institutional veto before attempting institutional replacement. This is the cold lesson. It is not a comfortable one. The auspicious incident was a massacre. The Janissary Corps, whatever its organizational pathologies, contained thousands of men who were killed, imprisoned, or displaced. The speed and brutality of the operation reflected not just Mahmud's political calculation, but his understanding that any hesitation, any partial measure, any negotiated compromise would recreate the conditions that had destroyed Selim. He was right. That rightness cost lives, and even after the cost was paid, the reform was incomplete. The Battle of Nizam demonstrated that removing an institutional obstacle does not immediately produce institutional capability. The Ottoman military would continue to develop, continue to engage European advisors, continue to absorb painful operational lessons for the remainder of the 19th century. The process that began with Vienna's aftermath did not conclude with the founding of the Mansour. It is still not entirely concluded. The modern Turkish military, its staff structure, its officer education system, its doctrine, carries the imprint of this long process. The institutions built by Mahmud and his successors, modified and extended through the Ottoman collapse and the Turkish Republic's founding, remain visible in the organizational DNA of a 21st century military force. The reforms that began in response to Vienna did not simply modernize an army. They changed the relationship between the state, the military, and political power in a way that persists to the present day. The destruction of the Janissaries removed a military actor that had been capable of political veto. What replaced it? A professional military theoretically subordinate to civilian command created a different set of long-term institutional questions about civil-military relations that the Ottoman and Turkish states have grappled with continuously. History does not arrive at conclusions. It generates conditions for new questions. The Janissary Corps is ash. The military schools that replaced it became universities. The artillery corps that Bonneval began reorganizing in the 1730s evolved into a modern combined arms force. The gap between Ottoman and European military capability that was exposed at Vienna in 1683 was, over the following century and a half, substantially, though never completely closed. What if I told you that the most important weapon in any war isn't a sword, a tank, or a fighter jet? It's something much more fundamental: organization. The way an army is built, trained, and commanded has decided the fate of empires more than any single piece of technology. This is the hidden side of the art of war, the revolution that happened not on the battlefield, but in the barracks and command tents. For centuries, armies were often just temporary gatherings of knights, mercenaries, or levies. They were powerful, sure, but also chaotic and unpredictable. Then, a few brilliant minds started to rethink everything. Take Maurice of Nassau in the Netherlands during the late 1500s. He looked at the ancient Roman legions, their discipline, their drill, their small, flexible units, and thought, why can't we do that? He introduced constant drilling, standardized commands, and volley fire, turning a ragtag group of soldiers into a disciplined, unstoppable force. This wasn't just about fighting better. It was about creating a reliable military machine. This idea caught fire across Europe. Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden perfected it, creating a professional national army with light, mobile artillery. Frederick the Great of Prussia took discipline to an extreme, creating soldiers so well-drilled they could maneuver and fire with clockwork precision, completely outclassing their opponents. He famously said an army marched on its stomach, but he knew it really marched on its discipline and organization. And then came the biggest game changer, Napoleon Bonaparte. He didn't just command an army, he created a new kind of army. By organizing his forces into self-sufficient corps, each a mini-army of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, he could move faster and strike harder than anyone had ever imagined. His opponents were playing checkers while he was playing chess on a continental scale. This corps system was his true secret weapon, allowing him to achieve those legendary, decisive victories. So, the next time you think about military history, look beyond the flashy battles and heroic generals. The real story, the real art of war, is often found in the quiet, painstaking work of transformation, turning a crowd of men into a unified, disciplined, and truly formidable fighting force. That's the innovation that truly changes the world. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history.